Do you guys have any preference for how I describe your podcast, or?
Brilliant, the best, genius.
Definitely that.
Go support their Patreon at the absolute highest level you possibly can. That would be the that would be the preferred way.
Absolutely, yeah.
I meant more like descriptive. We will definitely stick that in at the end, but.
No. I mean, you know the show. You know kind of what's going on. I don't have any problem with kind of whatever however you choose to.
Do I call it like a anti-Nazi podcast or anti-fascist podcast or?
I think we've. I think our intro we call it an anti-fascist podcast. So that's probably the way to go.
All right. Welcome to episode 61 of Polite Conversations. It has been a while. Today, I've got the wonderful, brilliant, and genius... Okay, I laughed too much for that. Hold on, let me do it again. I shouldn't have asked you guys how to describe it. Now I'm going to laugh every time.
Then honestly...
It hasn't even started yet, and I've already sabotaged it.
Like including the bit where you asked how should we describe it, and then that should be the cold open. That's definitely what Jack and I would do at this point. So
last time, okay. Welcome to episode. Oh my God, the pressure is just so high right now. Why am I so out of practice? Oh. Welcome to episode 61 of Polite Conversations. Today, I've got the guys from the wonderful and brilliant I Don't Speak German podcast here with me.
Make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects, and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial. Or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, ex-Muslim host Ina, keeping it non-controversial.
Jack and Daniel, how are you guys doing?
Hi, pretty good.
I haven't actually said your names together, and there's a couple of dad jokes that come to mind.
Yeah.
I bet you've heard them all. How are you guys doing during this wonderful, strange, bizarre reality that we all exist in these days?
Well, it's been 2020, hasn't it? So it's been a bit stressful for everybody, and I think I can say without fear of contradiction, a bit stressful for me included. But I'm still here. Certainly, Daniel, are you still there?
Still here. I'm just waiting for Comrade Biden to come in and just solve all the problems of the world with his radical socialist agenda. That's cool.
The leader of the Antifa super soldiers.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we would have survived the pandemic if it weren't for the regular Soros checks. So, thank you, Mr. Soros.
That one time $1,200 really helped solve all the financial issues I've run into over the course of the last 10 months or so.
Yeah, it came with Trump's signature on it, but we know who it was really from.
Yeah.
So, what's been going on? I see you guys have been covering the intellectual dark web a little bit, and that's quite interesting because you guys are normally Nazi watchers, right?
Well, I have to say, in all modesty, it's more Daniel who's the Nazi watcher. I'm the more Daniel listening to talking about Nazis.
So you're just the guy that listens to Daniel talk about what Daniel talks about, basically.
That's me. Yeah. It's more therapy than anything else.
It's an important job. Hey,
I like to think so.
Yeah.
I agree. I couldn't do the show without Jack. I did one episode without him, and I'm like, no, this took like 10 times as long. Please, no, we need Jack. Like Jack edits everything. Like Jack does the back end like production work on everything. I did one episode by myself, I should say, because I've done a number of like guest episodes without Jack. But then Jack does the, makes everything sound good and like uploads it and puts all the links in and all that other sort of thing. But I did one episode like completely by myself, which was the first clip episode, which I decided to demonstrate that the Nazis, the open National Socialists who they were telling some lies. And I decided to do a little episode like cutting in a bunch of clips. And since then we've been doing more clips in episodes, which we resisted for a long time for a lot of like kind of complicated
Oh my God,
reasons.
it's such a pain. Oh, it's such a pain, let me tell you. I wish I had a Jack.
Yay too.
But yeah, so you guys normally cover some really blatant, disgusting, like full-on Nazi stuff. But then, Daniel, you were kind of interested in some of the IDW guys too, which I find really interesting because it's such a strange coincidence that the Nazi covering, Nazi watching guy, like, I wonder why he's like, also interested in covering the Brain Genius crew. Why do you think that is?
Almost as if the IDW, and I want to be clear that like most of the people in the intellectual dark web are not overtly Nazis.
No.
In fact, none of them are overtly Nazis. But in fact, the first episode that we did regarding these guys was the Sam Harris episode, which we should probably talk about at some point, given that you have actually had Sam Harris on your show. Somehow I don't think he's chomping at the bit to come on. I don't speak German anytime soon.
I don't think he's coming on my show again ever either.
Yeah, he goes out of his way to call you out on other people's shows that have much.
Call me out, or just call crazy, because I'm so crazy that I criticize him.
Yeah, well, telling lies about you as well, and it does seem like that's kind of a pattern with a lot of these guys. Given it's kind of previous guests of the show have had similar issues with some of these guys, particularly Eric and Brett Weinstein, who we'll probably get to shortly. But one of the things, and I think Jack can speak for himself, but I think we would both agree, and he will very he will speak for himself. But
try to step back and make room.
That's fine. No, I think there is a sense in which we both sort of come out of the new atheist community in a way. We both kind of went through that community back in the late 2000s, early 2010s.
Hashtag solidarity, guys. I've been there.
We're all veterans of the new atheism wars, I suppose.
Yeah. Embarrassing.
And if you look at sort of the social origins of what we call the alt-right, which I don't use the term alt-right, effective from the new atheist movement after the elevator gate phenomenon, which involved Rebecca Watson in 2011, making the very mild statement that, hey, maybe you shouldn't hit on women at 3 a.m. who are drunk and offer them to come back to your hotel room. Very mild
in an
statement.
elevator.
In an elevator. Right. And then Richard Dawkins kind of got in the mix and decided he wanted to throw his dick around, et cetera, et cetera. But if we can't accost women in elevators, what does it mean for the freedom of people to engage in honest debate? And so
Al Qaeda already won.
Now, see, I kind of wasn't very online around that time, so I came into this only just hearing about Elevator Gate as this oh my God, it was just horrendous. Men can't in their direction. And so I had this distorted view of what it was. And until recently, the Me Too stuff came around. I didn't even think about it that much, I guess, the elevator gate story, because I wasn't really there for it. I just knew in the back of my mind that people had really talked about it as being this ridiculous story. So then I went back and looked up all these videos and started like listening to the actual story. I looked up Rebecca Watson's like account of it, and it just was so mild. Everything was so mild and reasonable, you know. I had pictured like all this ridiculous shrieking because that's all I had heard, right? Everything was so toned down and just nothing to make such a big deal about.
You mean Watson was very...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she was completely reasonable in what she was saying.
She was, yeah.
I had just no idea. And looking back at it, like I guess around 2018, and trying to learn about this situation, like so many years after the fact, it was just very bizarre because for so many years I had heard about this horrendous SJWs, like elevator gate story, and just completely distorted.
A huge overreaction.
Certainly very revealing, isn't it?
Yeah, from the guys who are all facts and no feelings. Definitely those guys never get emotional or anything, you know, so...
Right. Oh, God, no. No, right. It's all very Socratic and Baconian and detached and spooky chin. Yes, we need to, you know, it's all... And until a woman says, you know, could you maybe not make me uncomfortable by propositioning me when you don't know me in an elevator at 3 a.m., you know, and then... To quote the Joker, everybody just loses their minds.
And wasn't it like after she had specifically been giving a talk about how these types of things like make her uncomfortable, and then someone actually after that talk then did it, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, and it's not as if what the point she was trying to make turned out to be unfounded. I mean, she was making really, as you said, a very mild point, and you know, that several people, particularly women in the atheist movement, if we want to call it that, had been trying to say there are problems here, as there are in all sorts of spaces. And then, you know, things subsequently proved that there most certainly was a problem. I mean, not least of which was the Shermer thing. I know those are unproven allegations,
but many of them, right?
You know, the whole thing ignited again when P.Z. Myers related the allegations against Shermer, who's of course now a member of the or sort of a member of the IDWA, isn't he?
Of the
so
what?
You can see the lineage there. The IDWA, that's what I call them. The IDW.
Okay. I had never heard it described like that. It's always been like this SJW versus anti-SJW conversation, like always every few years being rebranded. Now we're at the wokeness versus anti-wokeness, and it's always the same thing, and that's what Elevator Gate was about. That's what the biggest war in new atheism is always about, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the same figures from, as I think I intimated earlier, I mean, a lot of the same figures from Elevator Gate. You know, this becomes sort of a dividing line, which it always kind of existed, because I was involved in this kind of like online atheism stuff going back to at least like 2007, and I was even on like, you know, Usenet on the Talk Origins news group in, you know, between like 2003 and 2005, and you know, P.Z. Myers was sort of like comes out of that group. And, you know, a lot of the other kind of figures who, you know, Aaron Raw was on that news group, you know, a lot of these kind of figures. And there was always this kind of like gap between this, you know, kind of like lefty liberal SJW type and the more like, you know, right libertarian leaning people within the movement. And ultimately there was a sense of like, well, we'll all kind of make common cause against the right-wing reactionaries pushing religious dogma in schools and doing the creationism and being anti-gay and all that sort of thing, you know, in this kind of George W. Bush era politics. And there was always this tension, and you saw like this...
Sorry, just to break in, that's a big thing, I think, for people to understand that. I mean, certainly myself, I was never really so much a member of the new atheist movement, but I was certainly what you might call a sort of pilot fish or a fellow traveler or something, despite being very firmly on the left, you know, at the time, but having a pre-existing commitment to socialist politics before that. I kind of got drawn into this little cul-de-sac. I now see it as a cul-de-sac of kind of anti-clericalism, which is how I interpreted New Atheism at the time. And I think it's very important, I mean, not just in terms of my personal story, but in terms of the wider understanding of it, to point out that the moment, I think, is what did that to a lot of people, because you not only had stuff like intelligent design and the Discovery Institute and people like that trying to get that in schools. You had basically an open fundamentalist evangelical Christian as the president of the United States, fraudulent president, I might add. And they were, the war on terror and all that was, completely, millions protested against it. I was one of them. And I think, Dawkins, to his credit, I suppose he was against the invasion of Iraq. Hitchens, of course, was for it. Harris waffled, didn't he? But he's very much an apologist for the war on terror. I think at the time,
I am against Bush. You see, I mean, Bush is bad. We shouldn't shouldn't have boots on the ground. But bombing brown people is probably a very good
same
thing
shtick he does now with Trump.
Right.
But let me write this piece called "In Defense of Torture,"
But all I wanted to say was, I think the third
episode of what was then called Waking Up, it is now called Making Sense. Which, I think the third episode is
both completely ridiculous names for what it is.
Just for a moment, pause on the fucking hubris of calling your podcast either Waking Up or Making Sense.
But I think the third episode is why I don't criticize Israel, and basically saying, like, well, the apartheid crimes of Israel are not something that I need to be critical of, because don't we really need to focus on the dangers of jihadi terrorism instead?
But is that not his line for everything, though? Why don't I criticize white supremacists that much? Because, guys, it's not Islam and it's not global jihadism, which is the only civilizational problem that the world has, and the left is so wrong about it that you can't blame poor innocent people for turning to the right.
Just finish up what I was saying was that it was possible at the time in that context, with Bush as the president and the rise of right-wing Christianity very much on the rise. I mean, it was pre-existing, but it was on the rise in that early 2000s period, for somebody, including somebody very firmly on the left like myself, to fool yourself into thinking this is a fight that needs to be fought. This is a discussion that needs to be had, because there's this rise of reactionary religionism. Not that I'm against religion per se. I've graduated well away from that. But that was possible for a reasonable person to think for a while. And you could say, well, Dawkins.
I mean, I'm not a fan of religion even now, but I'm very different from what New Atheism was.
Yeah. But you could, certainly speaking for myself at the time, it was possible to look at Dawkins and think, yeah, well, I don't like his sort of sociobiology, and he's a liberal politically, don't like that. Hitchens, I had been an admirer, and then he went mad after 2001. But it was possible to go along with it for a bit. And then, funnily enough, it was reading Sam Harris that kind of snapped me out of it. Really, it was reading Sam Harris, because that was the moment when I realized, no, this is just apologia for state terrorism. This is just Islamophobic apologia for the war on terror. It's literally all this. So I do, in a way, or ironically, I have to thank Sam Harris for waking me up.
So he's not that wrong after all.
No, well, he's right by accident.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can say the same. Like, it was actually listening to his bullshit that who woke me up to his bullshit. But yeah, like, once you start seeing the larger patterns of things, it's very hard to unsee those, right? When you look at specific instances, you can still maybe make excuses. Oh, it's just this one time. He didn't mean it. Maybe he misunderstood. But when you look at it happening repeatedly over years and years and years, you're like, okay, come on, this guy is doing this on purpose.
Well, or maybe he's not. Like, maybe he really is that clueless. Like, I genuinely think he's that far up his own ass, honestly. and
No, but what do you mean? Like, yeah, okay, he believes the stuff he says, sure, but what do you mean he's not doing it on purpose? Like, of course he's, like, you think he doesn't think some of the stuff he says about BLM or Muslims or Muslim birth rates and demographics and praising Douglas Murray and Charles Murray, like, You think he doesn't really realize how that's incredibly right-wing or even bordering on far-right talking points
I think
of him?
Sam Harris, and we can disagree. I mean, like, this is my perspective. You've actually spoken to him, which, but my feeling is that he sees himself
one step away from greatness.
I think he sees himself as, like, well, I'm a good liberal, and I may disagree with some of Douglas Murray's politics. I mean, he said this explicitly in the...
He doesn't say
well,
that,
he
though.
says this explicitly in the, like, Ezra Klein interview, which I re-listened to this week in preparation for doing this podcast because I thought it might come up. And I am, like, genuinely fascinated with the whole, like, Sam Harris, Charles Murray, Ezra Klein thing. Like, I think it's a legitimately, like, there should be books written about this.
Oh, no, you're talking about Charles Murray. Yeah, I'm talking about Douglas Murray. Okay.
I mean,
yeah.
I'm moving to Charles more. I did say Douglas Murray before, and I was kind of thinking about that. Like, he does sort of... I don't think he realizes how far to the right Douglas Murray really is, because Douglas Murray will kind of make, like, sensible sounds about, like, well, I'm a conservative, but ultimately I understand we need to live in, like, this liberal democracy, and I understand that people may not agree with everything, but also we need to keep the Muslims out. And he's so, like, kind of focused on that issue, and he's so kind of focused on that thing.
Yeah, but when...
and I mean, one of the things that I find most disgusting about Sam Harris in terms of, like, just individual moments is the moment in which Douglas Murray is talking about what a serious versus an unserious civilization would be on Sam Harris's podcast. And he says, like, Islam is not looking at, like, the transgenders in their bathrooms and all their issues.
Yes.
Going, like a 13-year-old giggling child from, like, watching a Porky's movie. That's how he sees those kinds of issues. And I mean, it's vile, it's disgusting, and it is, like, I mean, there is a sense in which I really do treat the way that people view transgender people and the way people talk about transgender people is a very clear sign. It really is the end of the wedge in terms of, like, kind of current discourse right now. And, like, if you are not fully on board with transgender people being treated with full human rights,
they would, of course, never acknowledge that in that way, though, right? But yes, there's trans people, there's immigrants, there's feminists, women in general, Muslims, so many people, right, that they fall on the wrong side of, human rights.
Absolutely. But it is really, it does feel like an acid test just in our particular moment, doesn't it? The trans issue.
Yeah, because that's like the conversation that's happening right now, right? They're stuck in, like, I'd say the late 80s, maybe the 90s, where being pro-gay rights, pro-gay marriage makes them very much on the left, but that's not really true right now, especially considering how many, like, right-wing gay people there are.
Yeah, but as
his buddy Douglas Murray,
as
being
they always
one of them.
do, the conservatives hold out and hold out and hold out and hold out on an issue, any given issue, until they absolutely can't hold out anymore, and then they go, "Oh no, we were always in favor of that. But don't call us right wing."
And even on a micro scale, this IDW group does that so much, or even Sam does that so much. Just recently, in his stupid podcast that he put out, where he's like, "I'm handing in my imaginary IDW card." It's like, shut up. You put up with this shit. You propelled it. You posed in the fucking bushes for it. You did this very serious New York Times introductory profile piece, and now you're acting like, oh, it was always meant to be a joke. Like, okay, these guys are getting too embarrassing. Let me step away. Like, shut up.
How cynical that makes you look, Sam, honestly. God.
And his whole rejection is over the fact that, so many of them, like the Eric and Brett Weinstein are kind of like, well, Trump wasn't that bad. I mean, Biden is going to be just as bad, in this kind of, like, defense of Trump. And they're kind of going, well, Trump wasn't Hitler. I mean, Trump was, bad. But he wasn't Hitler.
No, but Sam is also at the same time saying Trump wasn't Hitler.
Sam,
he's so confused.
Sam is so anti-Trump for, like, just these, like, personal idiosyncratic reasons. Like, he's just so opposed to Trump as a personality, and he thinks like, and he thinks that makes him like meaningfully, anti-Trump. Like, the problem with Trump is not he wears bronzer and he lies a lot. The problem with Trump is he activated an open white supremacist movement, which are also people who listen to your podcast.
No white supremacy. It's just fringe of the fringe. What is that even?
Can I tell you my favorite Sam Harris episode recently is the one where he had Kathleen Belew on, and Kathleen Belew wrote a book called "Bring the War Home." And Kathleen Belew is one of the premier scholars of the white nationalist movement, and she explains to him in no uncertain terms exactly where this movement comes from and how it is activated by Trump, and how the history of it is built into the system of white supremacy as a system, not as a set of personal belief structures. And she goes through this in excruciating detail, right? And gives a brilliant interview to Sam Harris. And Sam Harris, he doesn't understand why she keeps using the word white supremacy, because he can only see that as a guy in a Klan hood, right? He doesn't understand it at all.
He is such a cartoon.
And even
my God,
after the interview is over, he records a segment, as he is wont to do. He records a segment in which he's like, well, it turns out that Kathleen Belew was a little more woke than I thought she was going to be. And I think she's rather confused about the nature of white supremacy. And it's like, she's one of the foremost experts. She's at Harvard. You brought her on because she had the academic credentials that you respected. Maybe listen.
Again, though, that's just such an asshole-ish thing to do. I can't.
Yeah.
Not even the first time.
I know that from listening to your show about him.
Multiple people that he's called on as experts on white supremacy, and when they've said, "Oh yeah, it's bad," he's like, "Actually, they're too woke."
It's just such an asshole-ish thing. I used to have a little podcast where I interviewed people, and I'm minuscule, I'm nothing. My old podcast used to get a couple of hundred downloads, and it wasn't like world experts and book writers on this and that. It was just people I knew online. I would never have dreamt in a million years of putting my own little extra bit on the end after the discussion where I say, actually, so and so's wrong about this, that, and the other. Well, that's just unbelievable.
I'm going to do that at the end of this one, right? Actually, Jack and Daniel are far too woke for me. I am supremely rational, and yeah. But yeah, I mean, it just happens too many times. So to go back to you think he's not doing it on purpose, how does he keep doing this? With Lauren Southern, she's just a conservative journalist. Milo is too flamboyant to be far right.
I think he has this very specific kind of idea in his head. And I think I guess it's clearer with someone like Charles Murray, who he brings on and who he says, again, in the Ezra Klein interview, he says over and over, I'm not supporting Charles Murray's social policies. I'm treating Charles Murray's use of the science separate from his pronouncements about social policy, which is complete nonsense because in the full episode that he did with Charles Murray, which again I re-listened to this week, so I speak with some authority on this, when Charles Murray is describing the kinds of social policy that he wants to enact, which, to be clear, he does want to do something like a UBI, which will be funded at something like $1,200 per person per month, but use that as a way, as all these right libertarian shitheads want to do, as cutting all other social welfare spending everywhere. And so essentially it's you don't get food stamps, you don't get, it's unclear exactly what the limits of this are, but essentially it's we're going to give you $1,200 a month, and that's going to force you to behave better, to behave in a way that I think you should, and we're going to cut social welfare spending. So it ends up being a way of immiserating the working
And it'll
class.
also be according to your skull shape, right?
Well,
I think this, what you're describing is what Eric Weinstein has called hyper-socialism, or was it hyper-capitalism? I can't remember.
Ultra-capitalism. I don't remember exactly.
What is with that guy and wanting to create these nonsense terms? What is with him?
Isn't there even a new one after the disc and the gen? There was I forget what it was.
Did you know about incons?
Incons.
Incels?
That's fantastic.
Involuntary
conservatives. Which is totally the Matt Boris cartoon of you're the one making me do this.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a Nazi.
Yeah.
You're the one making me.
Yeah, but again, it's just the old canard repackaged.
Yeah, always. So, yes. So, what has sort of interested you in this group when you're usually like wallowing around in much more blatant, open, disgusting Nazi-ness? Why these sophisticated intellectual men?
For one thing, I think that particularly, in the last year or so, and I've said this before in a couple of places, when you look at, for instance, the 2016 election cycle, you saw memes coming from this incredibly far right space. The word conservative, for instance, if you remember that. That was bandied about, like it was sort of born in kind of the depths of 4chan, and then it got kind of transferred into the TRS forums, and that's the Right Stuff Radio Network. These are overt Nazis. These are the guys who do the Daily Show, a podcast, among others, who were highly influential, and then they pushed that idea into kind of mainstream Twitter before they all got banned from Twitter, and they had this, and so you saw you could point to these super far right spaces were actually being able to push ideas into the mainstream through social media. And you saw that all through 2015, 2016 to 2017, and then kind of after Unite the Right, the whole and that's the event in Charlottesville, Virginia, in which the tiki torch wielding Nazis killed a young counter protester.
Where so many new atheists insist that, Trump did sufficiently denounce the Nazis and the left lies, and actually there were very fine people on both sides. Right. Do continue, though.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. But the idea that they had a real ability to sort of push ideas into the mainstream while they were still on social media, right? But over the last couple of years, I'm still following these guys because it's important, and I'm following the ideas and kind of understanding how they're processing events, but they don't have nearly the same ability to really kind of push things into the mainstream in the same way. And what I noticed was that instead, my YouTube recommendations, because I'm always kind of looking for the furthest right material on YouTube, and my YouTube recommendations started to become more IDW focused, more this kind of stuff.
Very interesting.
Right, and I started seeing in particular this kind of the idea that the struggle session idea that Quillette was kind of going with that these kind of corporate events of trying to understand the nature of systemic racism and the way that it might play in your own personal attitudes towards the people around you, and maybe you should question those things, was equivalent to the struggle sessions in Maoist China, and using those kinds of words. And those are things that came directly from Brett Weinstein talking on Joe Rogan and on Tucker Carlson after the events at Evergreen in 2017, right? This is a very kind of direct reference. And so when I started seeing those kinds of ideas being pushed from this, ultimately the IDW, despite their much more mainstream acceptance than the guys who make the Daily Show, a podcast, they are still fairly fringe. They're not really kind of getting, you're not seeing Eric Weinstein on MSNBC every night talking about what he sees of the Trump administration or whatever. He doesn't have that level of access.
No, well, the disc is keeping him out.
But Sam does. He won't maybe go on every night, but he certainly does have that level of access. And Ruben too. Okay, maybe not MSNBC, but he's on Fox all the time, which is pretty mainstream.
Right. And Peterson as well for a while.
And Peterson was just a global superstar there for a minute.
I mean, in fairness, a lot of his media appearances were couched in this controversial academic Jordan Peterson and some quite confrontational interviews and stuff like that. But even so, I mean, the amount, he was one of the best-selling non-fiction authors in the world there, wasn't he? He was all over them.
And the confrontational interviews just served as fuel for people to be mad at the left, right? That was the main discourse, even in the sort of liberal center that, oh my God, this Kathy Newman is ridiculous. That's her name, right? Kathy
Yeah,
Newman?
that's the infamous one, isn't it? And it was painful to watch some of these interviews because these people, they're just sort of mainstream, centrist journalists. They don't know how to handle this guy.
They don't fully understand, what they're dealing with. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so that's really interesting that your recommendations went from Nazis, your YouTube recommendations went from Nazis to IDWers, and
that's probably because a lot of the overt Nazis just got banned from the platform, and so the history. I did this with the episode that I did with Becca Lewis. We kind of talked about kind of the YouTube recommendation algorithm and the way it's changed, and like if you've been following the far right on YouTube for the last couple of years, or I've been doing it for like 4 years now, but if you've been tracking this stuff on a kind of a day-to-day basis, there have been like distinct shifts in the way that the YouTube algorithm just sort of recommends stuff, but it really started to become like a whole lot of IDW kind of related content at a certain point, and particularly once I started actually clicking on it and watching it and started prepping like the Brett Weinstein episode and then the Eric Weinstein episodes, then suddenly it was like I got like Coleman Hughes and I got like a whole bunch of like these kind of like lesser figures, and now like if I go and open up my YouTube,
the tier 2,
it's all that. Actually right now it's all like Tim Pool, because like once you start watching Tim Pool you just get more Tim Pool apparently.
There's always more. Yeah.
Interestingly, after watching an IDW video, like the next video that would queue would usually be another IDW video. But if I watch a Tim Pool video, the next episode that queues automatically is usually a Fox News segment, which is really interesting.
That's very interesting. No, I mean, I think YouTube joining it up is really interesting because, as we've noted, several of the key figures in the IDWA, the IDW, are former new atheist types. I mean, Shermer and Harris particularly. And I think YouTube played host to this, I suppose, in that sort of 2014, 15, 16 era, it played host to a very strong rising right-wing host of content creators, didn't it? That arose from YouTube atheism, So for it to give over to this new IDW material, that's a very easy transition for it to make ideologically, because they're related to each other and they have a lot of the same affect to them as well. And the central aim of both being, of course, to just relentlessly attack the left and to attack Muslims also to a great extent.
So many of these popular far-right figures now that you see them, I've known them from the new atheist scene for more than half a decade now, like Andy No. I remember when he was just like a rando 200 follower Twitter account that would always bug me for being anti Douglas Murray or be like, but Muslim immigrants are dangerous, and just look at where he is now. He's humongous as a figure, It's just so disgusting to see where all these people's roots are, in the atheist scene. And also, what's his name? James Lindsay. Fuck. That guy too.
Well, apparently Brett Weinstein actually visited Andy No in the hospital after the milkshaking brain hemorrhage event. He actually said that on, I think Andy No was the very first guest of Brett Weinstein's Dark Horse podcast. I'd have to go back and check that just to be sure. Yeah. So, and it happened kind of around the same time as well. He was a kind of a very early kind of person in that. And Andy No comes on and is like, I've had trouble being able to find things and understand things, and my vision is blurred because I got hit in the head with a milkshake, and I have a British accent now because that's the thing that happens when you're hit in the head with a milkshake, apparently.
That's how I got mine.
Is that what happens in Britain?
Yeah, that's right. At a certain age, everybody gets hit with a milkshake, and that's why we all sound like this.
I imagine
we don't really talk about it generally, but it's a rite of passage.
I'm imagining a Monty Python segment in which babies are born in Britain and then they're immediately just hit in the face with a milkshake. Sorry, that was only funny to me. But you mentioned James Lindsay, and just to put a pin in this, like, we talked about kind of new atheism and the anti-creationist wars and the anti-intelligent design wars, and that connects us immediately to the Discovery Institute, right? Well, the Discovery Institute is now working alongside James Lindsay, these like religious conservatives pushing
The irony. The
intelligent
absolute
design
irony.
are now working alongside James Lindsay against the woke and against the far left.
Right, and what are they framing it as? Like some kind of separation of church and state, like separation of woke and state. It is so many levels of fucked up that they're working with creationists to demonize the left and frame it as some sort of healthy secularism.
And not to put too fine a point in this as well, and this is the thing that really starts to worry me. Like, the figures that I follow are often like very tiny, irrelevant figures that have no like kind of actual pull outside of their own communities and in terms of social media. And like, we follow them in order to keep them small so that people understand them and are able to oppose them in whatever way that they need to be opposed, right? That's perfectly fine. But historically, and particularly if we're looking back to, say, to pick an example at random, 1930s Germany, the way that a certain political movement came into power was when the centrists in the government made a deal with the far right as a way of keeping the left from gaining power. And it's almost as if this is a pattern that repeats, and Jack would have much more to say on this topic in terms of the actual history. He's far more up on that than I am. But this is a pattern that repeats, and this is the thing that I'm very worried in a Joe Biden administration, like exactly who he chooses to ally with, because the fact that he's like going like, well, you Bernie types, you get to kind of be like left on the back burner. We really need to embrace the moderate Republicans, like Paul Ryan, apparently,
Yeah.
Not Paul Ryan. He's been out of government for a while, but you get the idea, right? Yeah.
I do get the idea, but I want to just be happy for a few days about there being no more Trump.
I think that's allowable.
Yeah, we can deal with this in January.
Please.
We can deal with this in January.
Exactly. Oh.
Well, I mean, Jack is actually a Marxist, so you know what those Marxists are like.
A postmodern neo-Marxist.
Don't get me started on that one. That is so incoherent. It's I can hear 100 university lecturers just laughing.
Yeah, and the guy who is a university lecturer who spouts this incoherence is the one that's getting famous, strangely.
Absolutely.
Which reminds me, I've been watching this, I don't know if you guys have seen this documentary about the NXIVM cult called The Vow. Like, have you heard of this cult?
I know the cults. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't watched the documentary, but I'm aware of the cult. Yes.
I heard of it mainly from when I was researching our friend Tim Poole, and I discovered that he'd given them members of the cult a glowing softball interview after it had already.
Just unbelievable how much of this is like such a gross web of bullshit. But yeah, so this NXIVM cult, there's so many little like pieces in that documentary that remind me of these like modern day like cult of personality sort of, not necessarily religious, but like secular culty movements, right? There's like whiffs of Stefan Molyneux bizarre gender stuff, and there's like whiffs of general IDW-ness where he's like, we only look for like critical thinkers, and by joining us you're going to be thinking about things in such a unique and freeing way. Like, this is the kind of stuff that you believe when you're like, oh wow, this amazing new atheist content, I've been fed all these lies, religion is true, and you feel like you've come to this unique experience. And it was very scary for me. Like, obviously the sex cult stuff hasn't happened that I'm aware of, in terms of the rational movement or the new atheist movement. No one's been branded or anything, but just how reminiscent it is terrifying to me, because I already feel like I kind of left a cult, But this makes me feel a little bit more like I left a cult, and it's just disturbing.
Well,
to notice.
There's a precedent for these sorts of political ideas turning that way, isn't there? You only have to look at Ayn Rand and objectivism.
Well, which Michael Shermer himself pointed out to great disdain from a certain segment of his reading audience. And I think his first big book was Why Do Smart People Believe Weird Things? I think that's the title of something like that. And he devotes a chapter of that to the sort of objectivist cult and like describes it accurately as this kind of weird culty phenomenon who, you would think would be people who are interested in kind of rational thought and rational debate, but who actually, sort of worship Ayn Rand and her, kind of later acolytes as, prophets of some kind, and like will refer back to the words of Ayn Rand as if they have meaning, like truth value outside of their rhetorical value or their evidentiary value, right?
He says in that he still subscribes to many of Ayn Rand's ideas, and then he goes on to write.
Oh,
he goes on to write a book. I can't remember what it's called.
The Mind of the Market, I think, is what it's called.
That's the one, and it's basically social Darwinism and sociobiology with libertarianism, isn't it?
Shermer was someone I had a lot of respect for a long time. He wrote, I'd have to go back and reread it, but he wrote a pretty good book about kind of like the nature of Holocaust denial. Why do people deny the Holocaust? Again, I haven't reread that in a long time.
But then he went on and praised Stefan Molyneux as one of the finest podcasters for Reason or something.
Well, and of course also, Shermer, again, just to reiterate this, like very credibly accused of basically being a Bill Cosby in the New Atheist scene. So when you're talking about sort of, kind of sex cult and, sexual abuse of women, etc., I mean, Shermer is really kind of the test case for that.
Not to the extent of Bill Cosby, but like, from what I read,
like the allegations in the Shermer thing. And so, look, I'm going to say for myself, like, allegedly all over all of this, because there was never a court case. This has not been outright proven. But the idea that, you ply women with drinks, maybe you put a little, like, something in the drink, and they kind of black out, and then they wake up and not quite knowing what's happened to them. That's not something that happens once. Like, this is something that you work your way up to and then like continually do. Again, we don't have any confirmation of this, but he's also been very friendly with the Amazing Atheist. It has appeared on videos with the Amazing Atheist, who has like similar issues in terms of patterns of behavior regarding his sexual behavior.
Oh, really? I didn't know that one. That's the YouTuber guy?
Yeah, I don't think that TJ has... I want to be clear, I don't remember the details on this. So, again, please, like, it's been a while since I've thought about these guys. But I don't think that there's quite that level of, like, because TJ is not as famous as Michael Shermer. He doesn't get to go to big, like, atheist events and, like, ply women with drinks. But there have been allegations against TJ that I think sound really credible. And he's also someone who's very openly, said various things like, "I hope you drown in your rapist's cum," sort of thing. I mean,
Wait, what?
Yeah.
He was having a rant about rape survivors using the word survivor to describe themselves, I think, and he was told off by a rape survivor, and that's what he came back with.
Oh my God! Wow.
On the subject of
clearly, I have missed that. I have missed that whole guy. Thank goodness. I don't know much about him.
Yeah. He was a huge deal in YouTube atheism. Again, paving the way, I think, for the IDW inflection on YouTube.
Yeah.
Kevin Logan did a very nice video about the Amazing Atheist, which I could recommend.
Oh yeah, I do like his series. I've checked out some of it, and he's been on the show too. So I will look that up. But
Randy also said something about Shermer, didn't he? James Randi, because he was quite friendly with him, and James Randi said something like, "Yeah, I've heard that Shermer's been a naughty boy, but it's not violent, so it's fine."
Yeah. Oh. Kill all your heroes, including us, by the way. So I love that we're kind of reaching this point of like where we're all just kind of like, oh, that's really awkward, that's really terrible. What do we do? And it is the thing where I do like joke around with people, and it's like, no, I Don't Speak German is the darkest podcast in human history. Effectively, it is. Let's mine humor out of Nazis. That's literally what the podcast
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, if you're rolling around in the Nazi content filth pile, then I bet it is. But then you see, even after coming from all that blatant Nazism, you see how disturbing even the polished up versions of this shit are, right? Like, even if someone isn't like a blatant Nazi, the fact that they're saying that the BLM protests are equivalent to Kristallnacht or whatever,
Eric Weinstein. Yeah, that was the moment I saw that, and I went like, all right, time to do some episodes.
Okay, buddy.
That often happens. It's like, oh, you are now on my radar. Congratulations.
Yeah. We have, Daniel and I have this recurring thing where we're always chatting in the back channel, and we'll get to, oh, have you seen this, that, and the other? Have you seen what so and so said? And there'll be a little pause, and then another message will pop up from Daniel and say, yeah, I've opened a file on him.
Out of the non-Nazis that you watch, who are the most concerning to you, and why?
Most concerning? I mean, Eric Weinstein, because he's like personally employed by Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel is a billionaire who had the ability to crush, fairly large media organizations on a whim, effectively, right? And so, like,
So even though he's not invited onto MSNBC nightly, he still kind of has the links and the connections to be very worrying.
Right. I mean, like both Weinstein brothers and Brett's wife, Heather Heying, have had, Heather Heying, I think. I don't know. It's funny. Like when you ask this question, it really does just kind of like, I'm just going to get myself into trouble. I think Heather is kind of like the one of these people kind of in that space that I find the like least defensible on any level for a wide variety of reasons. And like that could sound like I'm being misogynistic, except that I think that the work that I've done in this space to like expose Brett and Heather and the clips that I've played from them on our show have, I think it is a reasonable conclusion to draw. But I do find her, like, in terms of like kind of the direct thing, she is much more willing to kind of be really openly transphobic. And of course she's allowed to be because as a woman she gets to go further than.
No, I mean, you shouldn't get to
I'm not
as
saying,
a woman.
I'm not saying she should get to. I'm saying
it's
kind of a point of practice, right?
She's also very misogynistic. Like, I read an article that she wrote, like, misogynistic in general, like, that could have easily been written by an Islamist mullah, where she was like, what was it, like, about toxic femininity or something like that. It was so bad, so beyond bad. Like, women are enticing men, and then when they get their attention, then they won't let them touch, or what. I don't even remember, but it was such bullshit. It was so horrifyingly bad and regressive and dangerous. And I think Sam Harris retweeted it. Like, I'm like, dude, why do you hate Islamists again when you're retweeting this shit? If you just put it in the right package for them, I think they don't actually mind some of the ideas.
Right. I mean, it really is like you repackage it. And I mean, even among the kind of like the real kind of overt Nazis who, like, they are generally more on board with, kind of like jihadist beliefs about women, like the ISIS beliefs about women. Mm-hmm. Actual National Socialists, like genocidal in their ambitions Nazis, will kind of look at sort of like ISIS propaganda and then reuse it for themselves. Like you see like very clear kind of like groups, like militant groups like the base, despite the fact that the base, Al-Qaeda means the base in Arabic. The base did not name itself after Al-Qaeda. That much is true. That said, they did absolutely produce propaganda videos that were directly based on like ISIS videos. Like they were using
really?
the same kinds of like propaganda techniques. They learned from the way that ISIS did their thing, and they produced videos that look very like not shot for shot, but like very similar in terms of tone, except like
Oh
there
my
are a bunch of doughy
gosh.
white guys like kind of wandering around in like with what looked like airsoft guns, but they were doing kind of similar things in terms of trying to recruit. They used that same thing. Plenty of like the absolute far right, like terrorist themed Nazi groups that I've been following for the last few years will actually derive a lot of like strength from like what they want is essentially America as ISIS. They want those kinds of social strictures around like gay people and trans people and women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they'd use that same language of like, well, that's like a real civilization. That's a civilization taking itself seriously, you see. That's a civilization that really like understands what it means to be strong versus weak, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get right back to Douglas Murray saying the same thing,
and Jordan Peterson saying that feminists crave masculine men or crave touch, or I don't know what he said, but it was something along those lines. Can't remember the exact words, but it was like feminists. What is it? They want to be dominated by manly men.
Again, it's always the same with these people. It's the old canards repackaged in pseudo-intellectual language. With Sam Harris, it's how can I be racist when I've got a black friend? How come black people are allowed to say the N-word? Repackaged in pseudo-intellectual language. With Jordan Peterson, it's feminists just need a good dicking. It's the same shit that your grandpa used to say, just repackaged.
Right, your bigoted grandparents have said what these guys say, and they've put it out in the world for free.
It's so fucking vapid. But there's a huge market for it, couched in this different aesthetic.
It's so sad. It's so sad, like how many people fall for this shit, and how many people feel like they're special for falling for this shit. Like, after Sam Harris's handing in my IDW card because it's starting to look real bad on me episode, there was people like in his comments like possibly the most sensible man on earth, and oh, this is so poetic, and oh my god, like they were just like coming basically from this nonsense, and it's just I don't even know what to say.
Wasn't there a guy
really.
that got a Sam Harris tattoo? He had Sam Harris's face tattooed on him.
There are a few. Just look at it. Don't Google that.
Like, at what point do you think, I admire this man because he's a fiercely independent, free-thinking, rational... He's not, but that's what they think. So I'm going to get his face tattooed on my epidermis. I mean, what the...
Yeah, he's so free-thinking that there are, like, I don't know how many right-wing intellectuals spouting the same nonsense to varying degrees. Like,
absolutely.
Well, and it's illegal. Like I mentioned that, like he brings Kathleen Belew on his show, and then like afterwards has to just kind of go, well, she's a little bit woke for me, and so you have to kind of like distance himself and kind of dust himself off for his audience. But then like he brings Andrew Sullivan on, and there's no like apologies for like the support for the Iraq War, the decades.
No, he likes him though. You see,
he can bring on. He brings on Jonathan Haidt.
United in there.
He brings on Jonathan Haidt on a number of occasions, and Jonathan Haidt is literally quoted in terms of a lot of his like earlier work is quoted by the overt Nazis. Like Richard Spencer will quote Jonathan Haidt as like a justification for Richard Spencer's larger political project, and there's no sense of like, I need to distance myself from him, like Sam Harris will say, and I think you pointed this out on Woking Up, is that Sam Harris will say, I will take a good idea from even the worst people that are out there. I will take a good idea from terrible people. And yet when you look at the people who are actually invited on the show, like he says, like, I won't bring an Ibrahim Kendi on the show. I won't bring, an actual like kind of anyone even remotely on the left. Like, can you imagine like Bernie Sanders on like Sam Harris's show or like AOC?
Please no.
I mean, I'm not saying they should do it. I'm just saying like there are people like who are meaningfully on the left who could make a meaningful case for a woke socialism for some.
But he hates AOC so much.
Right, he does. clearly, like, but that's the point, right? Like, he claims to be like,
But yeah, he's not in it for the difficult conversations, the
I'm
challenging
a rational
conversations at all.
centrist trying to have like a reasonable conversation, and no idea is off the table until it has been like rationally considered, except for the idea that like, hey, maybe there shouldn't be poor people anymore. Maybe there shouldn't be poor people.
Except for any idea that's on the left of Douglas Murray.
And again, he announced
he calls Ezra Klein just for your audience to make Ezra Klein
Far
is
left.
just as bigoted as the Ku Klux Klan, but in the other direction. That Sam Harris is like stated in multiple occasions.
Yeah, he basically said that he has the intellectual integrity of the KKK.
Right. Yeah. And like, Ezra Klein is a very like kind of like wonkish center left person, and I have deep problems with Ezra Klein from the left. Just to be clear about it. Right?
Yeah. But Ezra Klein is who Sam Harris thinks is far left. Like ridiculous wokeness.
Just to be clear, Ezra Klein.
They're also worried about Kamala Harris being like an avatar of wokeness, by the way.
Former prosecutor who put trans people trans women in men's prisons. Like, that person is going to be like the avatar of wokeness, right? And just to state this, like Ezra Klein. I listen to Ezra Klein's podcast. He's the way that I keep up with like neoliberal wonkishness, like, because I do try to keep like a whole lot of political positions in my head at any given time to understand how like this stuff works. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I apologize.
I mean, I enjoy some of them.
I do too.
Some of them are.
There is some great stuff in there. I think there's a lot of bullshit, but I think there's some great stuff.
Yeah.
And he actually does the thing that Sam Harris pretends he does, and like kind of bringing on people from a wide variety of political positions.
Yeah, definitely.
And he actually does have meaningful conversations with people. The late Michael Brooks, who I know has been on the show, did the exact same thing, and he would bring on people from various political persuasions that have like detailed political conversations about real issues and come to some kind of meaningful dialogue. Whereas Sam Harris brings on some far-right dipshit. They beat up on the left for a while, and then it's like, yeah, isn't it great that we're like reasonable centrists here?
Meanwhile, anyone who isn't a far-right dipshit, there has to be a special segment recorded saying they're too woke. Right. Or a full-fledged falling out, like with Christian Picciolini. Like, imagine that being the hill you want to die on, where defending Stefan Molyneux's honor was so important because you not only edited out his comments, but your own criticisms of Molyneux, too.
Right. Yeah, and just for the audience who may not be aware, like they did a live show. Christian Picciolini did a live show with Sam Harris and described Stefan Molyneux as a Holocaust denier.
He said he toes the line to Holocaust denial, to so episode. He was a bit more nuanced. I listened to that
episode, but then wasn't archiving Sam Harris at the time, so I didn't get to go back after he deleted it and listen to the original thing. That's why I'm now archiving Sam Harris. Anyway, but yeah, no, I mean, I have not heard, Stefan Molyneux kind of directly do like actual like 1940s Holocaust denial, but Stefan Molyneux definitely denies large elements of, for instance, like the genocide of Native Americans on the American continent. I mean, he is a genocide denier.
No, but even in terms of the Holocaust, he said things like, he blamed it on the communists or something, like a reaction to...
He's definitely kind of playing some kind of subtle games around like Polish nationalism.
Which is what he was saying. Picciolini was saying that he toes a line. Like, Holocaust denial isn't always just like, it never happened. There's different degrees to it, right? Like different sort of word games that people play where they're trying to still be accepted in mainstream society while still pushing the idea that it was actually a reasonable reaction or, really disgusting things like that.
Yeah. There's scholarship as well. There's sort of a trend of revisionist scholarship in Germany, particularly, but not just in Germany, which did exactly that sort of thing in again pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-historical language. People like Ernst Nolte, people like that, from which actual Holocaust deniers of various types have taken a lot of a lot of succor. And then you have people like Irving, who of course outright falsifier and liar, falsifier of history, Holocaust denier. But he couched it for a long time. He got away with it because he couched it in terms of apparently respectable history. And I think that point about there being all sorts of points on the spectrum and all sorts of different lines, as it were, that people inhabit and word games that they play, that's really a good key here, because I think that's what we see. You asked earlier why we switched from just recently for a few episodes, we started talking about IDW types. We've done an episode about both the Steins. We've done an episode about Tim Pool, etc., etc.
There will be a James Lindsay episode, fairly shortly, and then some of that so-called squared stuff as well. I'm in prep on that, by the way. Just
excellent.
Oh, that should be interesting and terrifying, and it's just sad.
I should say the choice of subjects is Daniel's. Daniel's the guy who, he decides on the subject matter. He tells me, and I say, right, okay, good. I'm very much the Eugene Savarini to his Mark Zuckerberg. But I think it's always been our position, hasn't it, Daniel, that this is a spectrum of people, and there's an ecology of reactionary politics, and it goes right the way across from people on the far right, the people that Harris calls the fringe of the fringe, the people that we generally stick to mainly talking about, the right stuff people and the Stormfront people, etc. And there's no hard and fast dividing lines. It's on a spectrum, and what you find is that people further along the line towards away from that towards the mainstream, they will have an appearance of more respectability, more mainstream acceptability, and to a huge extent it's just aesthetic. It's just because they present themselves in a different way, and they don't use slurs, and they don't quite come out and say it. They will nibble around the edges of these ideas, and right the way across to people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, etc. And again, we're always very careful to stress when we do these episodes, we're not saying these people are Nazis. Sam Harris is not a Nazi. We said that. It was kind of the title of our podcast about him, and it's true. He's not. Absolutely right. And
he definitely
and the Weinsteins are not Nazis. Tim Pool's not a Nazi. We're not saying that. What we are saying is
Tim Pool does hang out with a lot more Nazis than someone who isn't a Nazi should be hanging
Tim
out
Pool's,
with, just to be clear.
Yeah,
but,
Tim Pool's an edge case. He's a bit of a fascist. Yeah. But this is the point. There's all sorts of subtle gradations, and that's not to say, well, you have to be nuanced and you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. No. What you have to do is view the whole thing, the whole picture, and see these people as this long ecology with lots of different niches and spaces in it. It's like a market, really,
like a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, a marketplace of ideas. Yeah, which is kind of to me, it's kind of an inherently poisonous idea, but it's kind of what they've built on the business end of the right. And it is very much a business as well. They're all supplying to different customers who want a slightly different flavor, a slightly different aesthetic, and the same ideas go round and round around these people, and they will water them down for one audience, they will turn them up to 11 for a different audience.
Yes,
but they feed off each other, because one point on the spectrum can always point to another point and say, well, he's the real fascist, he's the real Nazi, he's the real extremist. I'm not. I'm in the center. That's the grift for a lot of them.
Yeah.
And that's also why they try so hard to say basically nothing is racist until it's like someone saying the N-word on tape, or like basically wearing a Klan hood. Because if you understand that racism is a spectrum too, and that you don't have to be a grand wizard in the KKK to be a racist, then that includes a lot more people, which they do not want.
Yeah, and they can peddle the same sorts of ideas and propagate them and popularize them under this guise of respectability. You can peddle Islamophobia all you like, as long as you say, well, I'm not an Islamophobe. There are genuine Islamophobes, and I despise those people. Or for whatever type of bigotry you're trying to peddle, you can peddle the watered down version, and you can point to the people over there saying it outright as the real bigots. I'm not a bigot. I don't think that way. I won't have anything to do with those people. And Sam Harris is a very good example of a sophisticated sophisticated operator in this respect, because he does this thing where he talks about, what I don't like is identity politics. So I don't like the identity politics on the left, but I also don't like the right or white identity politics, which is the far right. That's a clever rhetorical strategy, but that's all it is, a triangulation.
Yeah, that's spot on. And the way that he flattens it all out, often doesn't make a distinction between people actually fighting for their rights because they're being judged on their identity, and people fighting to oppress other people based on their identity.
To even compare the two things, it's like you're automatically giving, whether you're admitting you're doing this, you're giving ground to the claims of fascists and white supremacists that they are oppressed on the grounds of being white. You're automatically ceding them that point, even if you're not admitting you're doing it. So there, immediately.
Well, and when you look at the way that people kind of get into this material, like, people don't find the Daily Shoah because they're just kind of wandering around. So, it's a process, right? You start off with, you're watching Sam Harris, and Sam Harris brings on Charles Murray or Douglas Murray, and they're kind of talking about Muslims, and they're talking about IQ or whatever. And then, gradually you kind of...
And then Douglas Murray's book is recommended by Generation Identity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, you're kind of wandering around on YouTube, and maybe you find, I don't know how comfortable you are with me, naming a bunch of these places, but you find J.F. Gary Epi, you find Stefan Molyneux, you find some of these kind of other things, and then it turns out that they might bring on a guest who's I don't have a YouTube channel because I've been banned from YouTube, and it's like, oh, that sounds like risky and exciting. What does that person have to say? And then gradually you find these kind of further and further right things who are pushing a more pure version of the thing that you already kind of want to believe, right? And as you kind of fall down that process, you get further and further away from any kind of person who can provide the counterbalance to that, because all this stuff has arguments against it. The right likes to pretend oh, no one wants to debate us because they can't handle our ideas. It's no, 10 seconds of Googling, basic fact checking will defeat you utterly in 10 seconds, except you have this enormous kind of rhetorical technique in Gish Gallop and all this sort of thing. It's complete nonsense. Anybody who looks into these issues at all will find that you're completely full of shit. But you get further and further down that line, and eventually you find yourself in this, super far right place, but the structure of the argumentation often doesn't change very much. It's actually, once you learn to listen to these guys, ask me how I know, it's not hard to actually determine how they actually feel about situations and what is and is not a joke. But to get
their definition of good data is data that supports my case. Their definition of bad data is data that goes against it. Which
now you get it.
Very, very skepticism, much rational. Well done.
And
guys.
so when a right winger wants to laugh about how terrible transgender people are, well, I may not agree with 100%, but they've been maybe some trans person looked at them wrong in a bathroom somewhere, or maybe they just feel personally hurt, and we need to empathize and understand. And then of course the leftists, the far left, the radical left, regressive left, who think that maybe Charles Murray, whose book directly led to the immiseration of welfare policies in the United States in the mid-90s, should not be platformed as an intellectual worth paying attention to. Those people are just radical lefties who just want to shut down.
They're irredeemable.
Who have no point at all to anything they have to say. And that's kind of the point of, that's kind of the point here, is that, we have to, the point of the IDW is to punch left, right? And, as someone on the left, I don't like to be punched, so I'm going to punch back. And I'm going to point out the nonsense that they spew. That's the idea. Right?
How dare you? Because when you point it out, that is rude and lies and mental illness and just, hysteria. But when they do it, it's rational and just looking at the facts and evidence and critical thinking. And those are the rules.
That's right. But it's worth saying Sam Harris is, as I said, it was kind of Sam Harris who shook me out of my flirtation with the something like the New Atheist movement back in the day. And it was I mean, I can point you to specific lines that are burned into my memory. Like there's a line in Letter to a Christian Nation where he says the only people telling the truth or understanding properly, whatever it was, about Muslim immigration into Europe are fascists. Now he puts a smart caveat into there where he says that's not a healthy situation. So he's saying, it's not good that the only people talking sense about it are fascists because fascists are bad. But it's still a huge fucking warning sign there, because he's ceded the argument to the fascists now. And then the other one that always remember is The End of Faith. I mean, it starts with an outrageous move where he gives an anecdotal account of an intercepted suicide bomber, saying, "Oh, it was nothing to do with oppression or imperialism. I just wanted to be a martyr." Well, that's okay. Maybe there's an anecdote there where one person did that. The sociology about suicide bombing is very complex, but we know it's not that simple. We know it's embedded in a historical, political context of world politics and imperialism and repressive government and stuff like that. We know that. You can't refute that with an anecdote. And then he gets into it, and he gets into his extended sort of bashing of Chomsky, which is kind of a rite of passage for anybody who wants to be a respectable mainstream intellectual. And there's a line where he's saying, "Oh, for
all the issues that we would have with Chomsky, just to be clear."
Sure. But he's talking about Chomsky, and he says, well, he's talking about Chomsky's account of U.S. imperialism. And he says of America's conduct in the world, "No doubt we have much to apologize for." And that's just burned into my brain because the fucking glibness of that,
But let's skip past all that and
that's it.
Talk about what I want to talk about.
That's the point. All that stuff can just be batted away with a just... No doubt we have much to apologize for. And that's it. That's all of it. That's the coup in Iran. That's Hiroshima. That's everything you might want to talk about. That's, helping Pinochet take power. That's helping Suharto take power. That's all of that. Just washed down the drain. No doubt. Yeah, I mean, sure, we've got lots to apologize for, and then it's all just gone. All that historical context.
All of the Americas, all of Central and South America.
But like with Ezra Klein, and he does it repeatedly, where he basically says history doesn't matter, right? The context doesn't matter, and we have to talk about what he wants to talk about on his terms.
Priority is left bashing to a huge extent.
Oh, 100%. You can even see that in his takes right after the election, which I'm working on a Woking Up 3, which is analyzing his journey through the election, before and during and after, and it's quite an interesting ride. It's like with AOC's recent tweet, right? Where she said, "Is anyone kind of keeping track of?" I think she's talking about people working with Trump that are his enablers, kind of keeping track of what they've said and their tweets and stuff before they delete a bunch of stuff, right? And he interprets this as she's encouraging vengeance and for people to keep a list of anyone that's ever supported Trump in any capacity ever. It is such a lie. I don't have the tweet in front of me, but
and this is a completely bog standard right wing talking point around this thing. Again, Brett and Heather I think they did about 15 minutes talking about this tweet and how terrible it was and how can't we have reasonable disagreements and Trump isn't that bad. Sorry, Brett and Heather are kind of my IDW focus right now. Those are the ones that I've really,
the anti-vax biologists.
Well, yeah. Just to kind of highlight something we were kind of referencing there, kind of a little bit earlier, is Brett and Heather have been fully engaged with. Because they live in Portland, and so they've been really engaged with sort of the Portland protest, and demonizing the protesters as being this violent mob who's just out to destroy society with their wokeness and their Black Lives Matter and all this sort of thing, and reading from falsely applying bad ideas from Václav Havel and this sort of thing. Anyway, there's a lot I could say about Brett and Heather, let's put it that way. But one of the things that they come back to over and over again is this idea that look, the protesters, they just need to be put down. They need to be stopped now, using whatever techniques are necessary. And when you think about how chilling that what they're actually calling for, in their very reasonable and measured way, and they're very kind of reasonable. Like, we just want to have like real conversations about the issues, but there are these certain class of people they just cannot be reasoned with. They want to defund the police. And what does that mean? And there's no way for me to ever possibly know what defund the police
just don't look into that
mean.
ever.
And what prison abolition, it's not like there's a century and a half of writing on this subject.
Defund the police means that the left wants murderers to be set free and basically running things.
They just want to destroy society. That's all they mean. That's all that defund the police means. We need the police. What can you possibly mean? And so ultimately what they run into is, what we have to do is get the police, the federal troops, whatever it takes, some adult, some individual strong person with a will to do so needs to come in and just put down these leftist organizers who are trying to enact social change that I find distasteful, and I will ally myself.
So wait, what do they want done? Like, how do they want them stopped? This is sounding very concerning.
Like, this is sounding almost like, I mean, imagine like what kind of force it would take to put down a protest group.
What did they say the words put down?
I don't think they say put down, but they will very overtly in many places say that these people, meaning the Portland protesters, need to be stopped. This has to stop now. And the police need to come in and use essentially whatever force they need to do in order to make it stop. And the reality is that the Portland police are going about as far as they possibly can without actively opening fire on protesters. Like, the amount of tear gas that has been zooted over the city of Portland over the last few months has literally been visible from space. And it is on and I speak for myself here. I am not going to ask you to sign on to this completely, Ina or Jack. It is the heroism of the protesters in that place actually fighting against this oppressive, horrible system that they have been able to withstand the active oppression of the state. And in this matter, Brett and Heather and the IDW more broadly are standing alongside the police state against the protesters being tear gassed and being murdered and being assaulted night after night after night after night.
Wasn't Sam like saying that when you see like Antifa do these horrible things, and I think like the example that he used was like something that was cut out of context, where he said like, oh, they hit an old man, but it turned out like this old man had a machete or something like that. I think it was like several months ago, so I don't remember the exact.
There was an example of this old man who got assaulted by Antifa, and it turns out that the old man had a retractable baton, which only came out a day later when more footage and more photos were found of the incident. And B, was actually a member of one of these kind of far-right. I can't remember if it was a militia group or an active white nationalist group. I'd have to find the exact quote, and then I could probably find the documentation. But yeah, like, they will accept Andy knows lies about Antifa as God's given truth.
Yeah, basically.
Even when,
but yeah, so Sam in that clip said something like he was basically cheering the far right. He's like, you kind of hope for the far right to show up, and so that these guys will have to deal with real Nazis, and you kind of hope for the state to be as authoritarian as possible. Like, he literally said stuff like that. So,
well, no one has dealt with more Nazis than Sam Harris. Don't you understand? Sam Harris is really the one doing the real work, because there was this one time he tweeted at the world's racists about Neanderthal DNA.
Daniel, be quiet. We're not allowed to talk about Neanderthal DNA.
We're not. We can't even talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore. It's such a loss.
And I could also point you to like many, many examples of the world's racists who Sam Harris thinks he got a big on. Literally, what they do with that data once they find out that, like, oh, it turns out that European people descended from people who migrated to Europe 40,000 years ago have Neanderthal DNA in their sequences and versus people in Africa who don't. It turns out, no, that's actually what makes us great. Neanderthal DNA, that's clearly the thing that led to the greatness of European society. We white people
the greatness of the white
Neanderthal,
race.
and the Africans, the savages, don't. And that's clearly, and again, I can point you to many, many examples of this, which a simple Google search would reveal if Sam Harris chose to learn it. And he still touts that as something of like, I owned the world's racists by tweeting that one time. Also, Charles Murray is really misunderstood, and we need to listen to him on all matters scientific and cultural.
Yes, and going back to how we were talking about how this is like a ecosystem, right? Like a spectrum.
And another thing to mention with that is that it's not just a pipeline or a rabbit hole. It's also kind of a net, and it catches people at every point. They don't necessarily go to the center of the net, but they get caught along. So you might shy away from the outright, the far right, the outright Nazis that you're being funneled towards to a certain extent, but you're not going to then sort of leave the net. You're going to get caught at a further up point. So you're not going to end up with the right stuff and Mike Enoch and Stormfront and people like that, but you're going to end up an avid follower of Tim Pool or Andy Ngo or Dave Rubin, giving softball interviews to people like Lauren Southern, pushing the Great Replacement, which is just the white genocide conspiracy theory couched in aesthetically different terms. So.
Or when he had Stefan Molyneux on to discuss the differences between, what was it, like black skulls and white skulls, or black brains and white brains. And then he changed the thumbnail because of his YouTube video where it said like race and IQ on Stefan Molyneux segment on Rubin's show. But now I think the thumbnail has been changed to the controversy or controversies or something like that.
Again, going back to like late 90s, early 2000s culture wars around stuff like intelligent design. What's that if it's not teach the controversy? It's the same technique, isn't
it? Yeah.
And you just know that in Weimar Germany during the rise of the Nazis and Hitler, it wasn't just the people that were on the streets with the Nazis. It was loads of these people, these exact people saying, well, I don't approve of Hitler and I don't agree with the Nazis.
Just asking questions.
Exactly. Well, I don't agree with the Nazis about X, Y, and Z. But, they do raise some questions. I mean, aren't there too many Jews in the culture industry?
And just regarding like transphobia and that sort of thing, which I know I've come back to a couple of times, and like I don't try to speak for trans people, but I do like highlight this issue because it is such a wedge among the far right. Like the episode that I did, I think it's episode 52, which was transphobia and the right stuff, which I played a bunch of the clips of Mike Enoch and his pals literally praising the street thugs, the Nazi street thugs who beat Magnus Hirschfeld in the street. And Magnus Hirschfeld was one of the early scientists working and doctors working to actually help trans people to transition, and did a ton of amazing research into these issues at the Institute for Sexuality Research. And when you see the photos of the book burnings in Germany in the 30s, it was those books. It was his books. It was his institute that was burned. That's actually what was done. And the absolute far right, the literal Nazis, the literal anti-Semite Holocaust deniers, whom I have spent thousands of hours tracking at this point, want to use the transphobia of the center right, and people on like, oh yeah, I'm just a reasonable person. I'm just asking questions about like, well, medical transition should work. It should be giving hormones to children. No one is giving hormones to children. It's like, anyway. But want to use that disgust. Want to use that culturally ingrained disgust. They don't want to empathize with the trans people. They want to use that disgust that people have as a wedge, as a way of getting into their politics and infecting them with even further right, overtly genocidal ideology. And so
And when you see it in the context of history, like, it's far scarier than just the pieces you're seeing right now happening, right? Like,
if you're only seeing Sam Harris, or you're only seeing Douglas Murray, or you're only seeing Jordan Peterson, or you're only seeing, kind of whatever, you can kind of dismiss it as like, oh yeah, he's a guy, he's saying some stupid shit, but kind of whatever. But then you see the ecosystem, you see the structure, you see the larger pattern at work, and you understand that there are people who are treating people like Sam Harris and like the Weinsteins as useful idiots to push politics further and further and further right.
Yeah.
And the people I track are the people on that far end of it. And so I know what their goal is. And I know what they're trying to do. And those people need to be opposed. And that's sort of like, that's what anti-fascism is, ultimately.
right. I mean, to me, like, the more mainstream people seem like, as a person from a minority background and a Muslim background, it is the people with more mainstream credibility that feel more threatening to me. I feel like Nazis, like open Nazis, and people openly spouting like extreme racism and being against race mixing and stuff like that. Most reasonable people will look at that and just like reject it, right? But it's the subtler stuff that even intelligent people, if they're not actually following along and seeing the patterns and the wider picture, the things that they'll miss and they'll promote. Like, on the surface, if I see someone in the not online world just like talking about one of these PC gone too far story, so, like at some point it would have seemed harmless to me, like, oh yeah, they're talking about like the cafeteria that shut down because they what was it, like they wanted their gingerbread cookies to be gender neutral, or I don't know, some stupid story like that.
The college kids,
the right got really
running amok. Now it's some
right. So it's like
students doing a silly thing. Tomorrow you won't be able to buy the color blue anywhere.
Which is exactly what Brett Weinstein did. He turned college protests into, shining path, didn't he? Basically, he actually called it Maoism. He actually compared it to the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like, if there's like some kind of story that seems harmless, like, oh, someone said white pumpkins are racist on Halloween, you're like, oh, that's stupid, right? But if you see someone in the not online world kind of obsessing on this story, to me, it's a red flag, because like, I kind of have seen that path, right? But to other people observing, it's like, why are you finding that so concerning, I'll be like, ugh, like, I know where this anti-PC thing leads down to, right? Like, it's not just about people saying silly things are racist. It's about, oh dear, like, then it's like opposing the whole left, and it's like hating minorities, and then it's like, oh fuck, then it's phrenology. Yeah, totally.
And when this stuff that we see today, it's all descended from the political correctness scare that kind of started in the 90s.
Exactly.
And that was very deliberately started by very conscious culture warriors, people like Dinesh D'Souza, who's still around now, of course.
I think I saw a Peter Thiel speech or something as well from that era, the 90s, and
I don't know.
It was very much like it was done today.
Peddled by people like Murray Rothbard.
There's going to be a Peter Thiel episode. I've been digging into some of his stuff from the 90s, and there's so much there. Anyway.
I was just saying, it's descended from the PC scare, which is very consciously created as a culture war weapon to push the mainstream ever rightwards, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the mainstream being pushed ever rightwards. As noticed by the fact that the president for the past 4 years has been a more or less open racist and white supremacist, and it's happening under the influence of very much these sorts of people like the Weinsteins and Sam Harris and people like Tim Pool and Andy Ngo. These people are now mainstream or semi-mainstream. They're pushing the mainstream right. But they are, like a lot of these people, the collar around their neck is being tugged on by people like the far right fringe that Daniel and I look at.
So that's the connection.
I think so, yeah.
Between what I do and what you do.
I hope so.
And the overlap.
I mean, hopefully the idea is that, like, you don't have to agree with my politics in order to understand that there is a real connection to this kind of far right, organizing. They're like actually pushing genocide. And I've said on a number of occasions, like, the reason I do this work is to prevent genocide. Like, that's actually the scale at which I think we need to be thinking about our politics in this era. And Joe Biden being elected does not, like, change that, by the way.
Stop it. I said give me a month or so.
we still need to pay attention to it. But, like, that's the scale of...
Of course we do. But can we just have some days?
We have some days. I'm not saying Joe Biden is going to, like, commit genocide. I just want to clarify that, like, everything didn't get fixed. Everything isn't fixed when Joe Biden. Of
course, yes. Let's not get
there
complacent
are larger,
now. Yeah,
structural issues. So please, let's all, like, take a month off from thinking about Donald Trump. Wouldn't it be nice?
Oh my gosh.
And in that matter, like, even Donald Trump was not ultimately the avatar of this. It's the thing that comes after him. It's the structure that's being built underneath him. It's the thing that's being built underneath the log where all the maggots grow, where nobody wants to look. And the job of German.
So, like, when America has, like, a far right YouTuber president, that's what we have to really worry about.
Tucker Carlson may run in 2024, and Tucker Carlson's been pushing.
Who? Tucker Carlson?
He's been pushing.
He's basically a white nationalist. Yeah. Like, well, Trump is.
I mean,
too,
he's
but, like,
further than
Tucker
is further along.
Further
than Trump
along.
Is, And he had this guy who was posting on this, like, not quite explicitly as far as, like, the Daily Show up boards, but, like, might as well have been, like, this guy Blake Neff, who got fired after he was exposed.
Oh, from Tucker Carlson.
He was writing Tucker Carlson's monologues.
Yeah.
For years.
And it shows.
And
it shows. Yeah.
And there are people within the Republican Party. There are people, and we haven't really talked about this, and we need to, like, wrap up, but, like, there are figures who are trying to infiltrate the Republican Party and probably the Democratic Party. If they're smart, hopefully don't listen. Don't give them any ideas. That's a problem I run into on a number of cases, which the warning of things we might look forward to. I do worry that, like, the Nazis are going, like, that guy knows what he's talking about. Like, maybe we need to do the Democrats as well. I think the Democrats will be slightly better at, like, rejecting that particular virus. But there are people doing quiet, unheralded work within think tanks, within the Republican Party, and within, like, kind of that Republican infrastructure, within that media infrastructure, who are overt genocidal anti-Semitic Nazis. This is known for a fact. Mm-hmm. We know this to be true.
So what you're saying is that white supremacy isn't so fringe of the fringe.
Not. It's really not. What they do is they know well enough to hide it for now while they're in a more public forum. And so we have to understand it for what it is, and we have to oppose the people in the IDW, the people in that kind of centrist, let's just look at those sides, stepping stone spheres, and we need to oppose. We can understand that Sam Harris has some good things that he says very occasionally these days, but he occasionally is a reasonable human being, and we can acknowledge that, and that he's not a Nazi, and that he is either willfully or unwillingly, unknowingly, promoting far-right discourses that only gives succor to these overtly genocidal racists, even when he thinks he's opposing them, because he doesn't understand them.
Yeah. Every time he launders a point that he gets from Charles Murray, he makes the racist rhetoric of a Mike Enoch sound more respectable.
What do you make of Charles Murray? Is he also a useful idiot, or?
There's a very good.
Is there something to the cross burning?
Very good article in N+1 that describes Charles Murray's history, in terms of, like, he kind of got his start in Vietnam in sort of that post-war era, doing social support, and he kind of came to the conclusion, based on his observations in this kind of very limited space in which the U.S. government was doing very little to actually help the Vietnamese population for various socio-political reasons. But he comes to the conclusion in his writing and in his personal life that well, we just need to avoid giving kind of overt national social support, that any kind of social democratic institution is fundamentally going to do more harm than good. And then he starts to export that to his work in the United States. And like you can kind of draw a through line from that to the bell curve, to his work at AEI, to his UBI work. And like his entire career is about not so much being overtly racist. Like I don't think Charles Murray is a Nazi, right? But Charles Murray's like his entire thing is about the immiseration of the social welfare state, because ultimately people will behave better if we stop giving them money. And so ultimately what Charles Murray is doing is driving poverty, which drives crime, and then exacerbates all the further problems. Because when poor people are poor, they commit crimes in order to get resources they need in order to feed themselves, in order to improve their lives. And then the police state is increased in order to go against them, in which case, and then it all just goes into a cycle, because once you spent more time in prison, then you are less employable, et cetera, et cetera. And so any sense of kind of looking at these problems of like kind of criminality or anything like that without looking at the actual kind of sociological history of it is fundamentally misguided, regardless of how much data you have. Ultimately, you have to look at the politics of it. You have to look at the actual kind of sociological function of all this stuff, right? One of the sorry, again, I keep bringing up stuff that is we're trying to wrap up here, but the United States imprisons more people as a fraction of its population today than any regime in history, except for the absolute handful of like top years of the Soviet Gulag system. Not
Kyle Rittenhouse, though.
Well, yeah, Kyle Rittenhouse got to go out, and he's promoted by what is it called, the Black Rifle Coffee Company.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that's true. Just can you give some context on who he is? Like, just he's the shooter.
Yeah. He's the Kenosha kid. So he's the 17-year-old who showed up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who was quote unquote defending a car dealership. First of all, why the fuck would you defend a car dealer?
Well,
to shoot somebody.
Private property is a lot more valuable than the lives of black people. Come on.
I mean, it is. And like he was running through the streets, and like there's a bunch of video, and like, the exact accounts are disputed. But he shot 2 people, killed one of them.
He's definitely shot people.
He definitely shot 2 people and definitely killed one of them. And the other one, basically took that guy's arm. I'm not sure, like, if it actually got amputated or kind of what the situation is. And while Kyle Rittenhouse is not personally a Nazi, so far as we know, I believe one of the people he traveled to Wisconsin because he lived in Illinois, and so he crossed. It's like a 20-minute drive across the state border, but he crossed into Wisconsin. One of the people who he was driving with has a long history of forum posts on an actual far-right neo-Nazi forum,
of
and
course.
also his cause has been celebrated by the people at the Daily Show as one of their like central talking points that they use in terms of promoting their, again, overtly anti-Semitic and genocidal agenda.
Can you imagine what would happen if, say, that was like someone on the left that was getting bailed out and that had shot someone, or someone that was Muslim, or you know?
Well,
can you imagine?
It doesn't have to actually happen, though. This is the thing, because they just hallucinate it. You don't have to go very far to find endless tweets and posts and videos, whatever, about Antifa being this absolutely ruinous, murderous terrorist organization that burns cities to the ground and murders people left, right, and center. It's just completely detached from reality. We know the sociology on this. We know that it's something like 69% of domestic terrorism in the States States is from far-right groups. We know that more than half of that is aimed at people like protesters. And so we know the sociology on this, but these people live in, I think it was Dave Nyworth who called it an epistemological bubble. They just fantasize. There I go, using that. I'll be in trouble with Heather Hying now.
It's all just a fantasy. You see, oh, you use the word fantasize. That's how you know not a serious thinker on these topics.
But yeah, you're right. The hypocrisy is staggering.
Yeah, it's endless. I mean, we could have a 5-hour episode talking about the hypocrisy of the right or the hypocrisy of the IDW. But it's been so much fun chatting with you guys, and I'm sure we could go on, but all good things must come to an end.
I'm sure we could go on, but thanks ever so much for having us. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on your show, too, and for giving Woking Up a shout-out. That was very kind of you. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
We'll do it again once the next episode drops, for sure.
I'm sure I speak for Daniel when I say you have an open invitation to come back on IDSG anytime you like.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely, yeah.
And anything you guys would like to plug, or, obviously everyone should listen to your show and support you on Patreon because you are the brilliant genius IDSG.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I promised I would say that at the end.
Yep, I specified that Ina had to say that before we started, so she's fulfilling her contractual obligations.
She has to say nice things about us. That was not a thing that she did willingly. It was, we required it. It's a process. No, I don't speak German.libsyn.com. That's where you can find the podcast. It's also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud. I think it's on there now. Not on YouTube because we weren't getting anything on YouTube. I mean, Jack handles all the back end on that, so kind of whatever. But that's where you can find it. You can find me on Twitter at Daniel E. Harper. My Patreon is Daniel Harper, so you can check that out there. If you want to give me a couple of bucks, I will appreciate it. And I'm hoping to start writing in addition to podcasting in the very near future. Check that out.
Very cool. You guys should get like a sponsor that is some kind of German language
like
teaching.
Duolingo.
Yeah, there you go.
And then we could gradually learn German during the course of the show and change the title eventually.
And then you have to change the...
We could do a little segment where we suddenly start learning German. It's like Sprachen du Deutsch. I actually...
Oops, we speak German now.
I was actually trying to learn German with one of the online apps, for a while. And I kind of got to the point at which it was easier to just kind of game the app than it was to actually learn the material. Because the app just wasn't working for me because it didn't match my learning style. And so I kind of gave it up. But I did have this plan when we first started the podcast of I should just quietly start learning German in my spare time. And then start just laying it in here and there and be like, oh, well, in the original German, that's this, but now that I've said it on the podcast, I can't actually do it, which is a good thing for everyone ultimately.
I want to reiterate the title. Firstly, the title is my fault, and secondly, it's not meant to be any sort of shade on either Germans as people or the German language, which I actually think is a beautiful language. To answer your question, if people want to find me and my stuff, my Patreon, my writing, and of course IDSG, you can just best place to go is to my Twitter, which is @_Jack_Graham_, and you'll be very welcome.
Excellent. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great.
Okay, just popping in to say that conversation was way too woke for me, and because I am so rational, I just have to put it out there that those two guys were way woker than I expected.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/Nice Mangoes. No E in mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter @Nice Mangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no E in mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too.